look at European radicalism, European identity, and also Turkey's role in this mix. So that's a broad panel. We'll see if we can address all of these issues. But we have a terrific panel of scholars and speakers. Here you have their biographies in front of you. So I will be very brief and just introduce our first speaker, Joycelyn Cesari, who of course is an associate at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Center for European Studies, and teaches at the Harvard Divinity School and the Government Department. And she's also a senior fellow with Johns Hopkins University's Center for Transatlantic Relations here in Washington. She has at Harvard, she also directs, and this is the one other thing I want to mention is, of course, the Interfaculty Islam in the West program. There's a long, distinguished list of publications in the biographical sheet. I won't go read all of them, but we're very delighted to have Dr. Cesari start us off this afternoon. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm going to move to
Okay.
Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to present results from a recent survey we did in Europe, but also in the US among Muslims in Paris, London, Berlin, Amsterdam, on the European side. And we really try to interview Muslims who do not belong to any organization, either political or religious. And it took us a long, long time because, as you know, the climate around questions of Islam, identity and politics is not an easy one for Muslims and non-Muslims on the European side. So I would like to look at the radicalization question through this also angle of what lay Muslims, anonymous Muslims who are never interviewed by journalists or never participate in any political discussion have to say about it. And we had among them lots of people who may be attracted by what is called radical Islam. So just to start with a sort of premise, I think we have to be very clear on what we are talking about when we are talking about radicalization. First, there are people involved in terrorist acts, okay? And this is not new, first of all. we have to look at it through different waves of radical action, terrorist action that didn't start with 9/11. Actually, you have to go back to the Afghan war at the time of the Soviet invasion, and you find a lot of people who have been, now they look like veterans, but they used to be involved in this kind of terrorist and radical armed fight. So this is not a new phenomenon, unlike what people try always to present it. It is a marginal phenomenon. I give you here some estimates. I didn't produce them myself, so I always take them with a little precaution here. But even though, you know, you can argue that 1 to 2% of European Muslims is still a big number. The question is not on numbers anymore. I think that since 9/11 and especially since 2005 and the bombings in Europe, the perception of Islam as such has become radicalized. That's what I call in one of these recent publications, the securitization of Islam, in the sense that it's not only active, armed, radical action that are seen as a potential threat, but also expression of Islam. As one of our participants said this morning, praying or fasting can become a sign of terrorism. So in this new spectrum, the question of numbers doesn't appeal to anybody. And the recent events like the minaret debate, the burqa or niqab debate to be more accurate, is really a symptom of this securitization of Islam. And I will say a little more about it a little later. So the point is not so much on numbers, but looking at what does radicalization mean. If we eliminate the small number of people who can eventually become radical and join a jihadi group or make a jihadi action, what are we talking about? And that's where I think that I said it's a real risk. I cannot go through all my points on each slide, otherwise we're going to take a long time. I just want here to look at dominant social explanation for this radicalization. And most of the time, people will argue, and you have seen that also in the US through the discussion about the Times Square bombing, the Christmas Day bombing or attempt of bombing. There are lots of things going on with psychological fragility or anomia, and there are also in Europe, more than in the US actually, explanation going on with socioeconomic deprivation and the ghettoization of Muslim immigrants in most of urban centers in Europe. Through the collective work we are doing in this program, we are not convinced that these are sufficient to understand a potential radicalization process. To put it differently, if tomorrow we don't have any ghettos anymore in Europe, we are not convinced that radical groups will not attract Muslims, either born in Muslim family or converts to Islam. We are not convinced at all, and we are trying to provide then an alternative framework of explanation that needs to combine several kind of factors. I list them here and I will go through it very quickly. The first one is the Islamic religious market that we tend to forget. Because before becoming a political movement, Islam is also a religion, right? And I draw a distinction here. What we have seen in our research is that actually what I call the Salafization of Islamic thinking, even by people who are not radical. And that's why I think the biggest issue is. How does this work? This Salafization, it's not related to Wahhabi anymore. I know everybody will look at the Saudi funding and the influence of Saudi foreign policy on this issue. What we have seen across Europe and across the world is a sort of diffusion of the same kind of interpretation by people who are not related to Saudi Arabia anymore. So this is a Salafization of Islamic thinking, and you see it everywhere. Not only in Europe. It happens in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Africa, everywhere. In China. So this is something we have to address beyond the European case. And it's based on a certain number of principles that look at, you are Muslim beyond cultures and beyond languages. And it does in some way empower European Muslims because they are fighting a lot with the question of who am I? I am French, I am German, what is my language, what is my history? And there is a sort of empowerment related to the fact that no more cultures, language is important. You are a Muslim and you belong to this very abstract ummah, the community of believers. It's also so rejecting culture or discarding culture, rejecting history. In the sense that what makes the connection with the Ummah is to relate to the Prophet Muhammad in a very unhistorical, essentialized approach to the message, which is far beyond the richness of the Islamic tradition, which is the opposite, which is a very historicized tradition, actually. But the Wahhabi or Salafi message is telling people, you act like the Prophet Muhammad. At the time of Medina becoming the golden standard of the good Muslim. it's also based on a very anti-Western sentiment. You know, each group built itself in opposition to the other. We talked about this morning about the Muslim being the other of Europe. I mean, the West, not only Europe, the West is seen as the other of this kind of Muslim. And it does in some way echo with some of the discussion we have had with Muslims in this survey I mentioned, where they feel like they are not welcome as Muslims. And so sometimes the appeal to this interpretation of Islam makes sense in their daily life, where it is not automatically an international issue. It can also be at the micro level of interaction at the city council, in the school. The school is a major hub for tension of this kind, where people with a Muslim background, even if they are not particularly observant, and most of them are not, can feel a sort of tension because of their origin or supposed identity related to Islam. Another aspect which is also appealing is the Puritan content. There is a lot of insistence on purity. You have to be pure. To be a good Muslim is to be pure. And it doesn't mean only, you know, dealing with dietary rules. It has also to deal with gender segregation. And this reinforces the opposition with the so-called Western liberal, what some would call in our interview, promiscuous Western environment. And the gender segregation is very, very central to this perception of purity. Again, I am not only a specialist of Islam, but of religion and politics. This is a discourse you find also among Christian fundamentalists. And it's part of this globalization of all religions. The issue with this kind of very conservative very conservative authoritarian version of Islam is that it has also some political components to it. In other words, what we see in our surveys is that most of the Salafi are not jihadi, but most of the jihadi happen to be Salafi as well. So you understand here the conflict and the confusion for the political powers in Europe or even the external observer. How can I distinguish someone who is some kind of Muslim fundamentalist, conservative, intolerant? Okay, this is, but who doesn't have any political project, from someone who has a clear political agenda and armed fight against the West and that can look the same and have the same ideological or rhetoric based on Islam. This is kind of confusing. And that's why, for example, the French, but now all the Europeans have a big issue with the niqab. Because it's seen as a step towards this radicalization or terrorist act. While it may also sometimes, I'm not saying it says good things about the willingness of integration of the people who wear it, but it doesn't mean automatically that these people are at the forefront of an armed fight against the West. The security issue is coming very strongly in all this debate today about the visibility, the legitimacy of Islamic symbols in Europe. It also goes to the legitimacy of the minaret, which was not the case, let's say, 15 years ago. I have witnessed, when I was still in Europe, lots of debate about building mosques. The minaret was not an issue. But since this increased the securitization of Islamic symbols related to jihadi groups, it is also an issue. So it goes, this vision goes also with an Islamic feminism. There are different versions of Islamic feminism, but the one here is very much advocating a strict separation of the genders and oppose the Islamic code, dress code, to the Western lifestyle. The one of the article here called the burqa and the bikini, because it does show this kind of, you know, complete polarized antinomic vision. And here, before moving to other factors in the radicalization process, I think it's important to make distinction between Salafism, Islamism, and jihadism. the Salafi, or what my colleague Khaled Abou El-Fadl calls Salabism, is a movement which is a very totalitarian, fundamentalist, religious movement. We all agree about that. Does it mean that all the people in it are politicized and are ready to take arms against the weapons against the West? This is not an automatic connection. And I am completely aware, for talking a lot to European people involved in administration and security policy, how difficult it can be sometimes to make the distinction. But they are there, and what also is interesting is that in the Muslims we have interviewed, the majority doesn't feel comfortable with this extreme ideology or extreme vision of Islam. But in the same time, what I found very alarming is they do not have alternative option. We asked a question that for us was very interesting: what is to be a good Muslim? For people who are from different levels of identification, of involvement, when they give the different features of a good Muslim, a lot of it has to do with a sort of Salafi or neo-Salafi person, even from people who are very, very secular. And that's what I think is dangerous, because that's what I think is part of the issue, that even from people who are very secularized, the doxa of Islam, meaning you don't follow it. Most of believers, Muslims, are like everybody. You know, who follows point by point the doxa of any kind of religion? You know, it's kind of a big challenge. But what is now part of the common acceptance is this Salafi vision. And I think this is what is dangerous, because they have no more connection with the richness or tradition of the Islam in some countries, Muslim countries, including countries of their parents or grandparents. And Europe doesn't provide until now an alternative. Despite what we had heard this morning, we are still looking for alternative, credible figures shaping this Euro-Islam. So this is one trend that is coming up in urban space. The other one that is already much more limited is a more civic kind of engagement in the name of Islam that you can see in groups like the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers today, in their different shape and colors, are the ones that have been actively involved in the organization of Islam, in the public discourse of Islam. Again, when we look at our interviewees, they don't consider that these people who talk about Islam to the governments across Europe, and sometimes are considered as a representative body of Islam in some places, they consider that they don't represent them. And one of the issues came very strongly from women, and that's why I appreciated your presentation this morning. Women are saying these men do not represent us. We are Muslims, we live Islam, we are attached to Islam, but these men, they have a too much conservative social discourse for us. So here the point of disagreement is about the social, cultural and gender aspects of the public Islam that these men are trying to push forward. And again, the Muslim Brothers and the Salafi, again, maybe for you all these terms are the same, but people make lots of differences in there. They do not come together. I can give you a fatwa from some Shuyukh Salafi that have excommunicated the Muslim Brothers as not being Muslim enough. So there are real differences here. And I think we don't have to become experts. Far from that, but we have also to be aware of these differences and not to lump everybody together. And the third tier in there is the jihadi movement, that is the minority of the minority, that you can even relate through individual acts more than group acts. Think of Bouyeri, who killed Theo Van Gogh. Think even of the last events in the US. They were individually driven. I think this is where the jihadi movement can appeal to young people. I'm going to... The other factor to take into account, of course, there is this supply of Islam, okay? This is a supply of Islam. It does fight with other trends, but again, what we are witnessing is a strong presence of this Salafi interpretation. The second factor to take into account may be the weakness of social network. I don't want to bother you with lots of the theoretical background here, but the fact that there is this supply of Islam doesn't mean that everybody buys it. On the opposite, what I try to say here is that most of the people do not buy it. You need to add other conditions. And these conditions are related to your status as an individual or as a member of a community, not a religious community, a social community or a political community. And what we have found in our interviews is that actually more than the social or economic marginalization, the cultural marginalization is really a trigger in the sense of not being part of it. In other words, the more educated you are and the less you fit in the mainstream, the more you can be appealed, attracted to the radical version of Islam. And it goes with lots of, context on the urban setting, on the position. In other words, there is also this idea that if you go to an ethnic community, you may be able to find the radicals. It's the opposite. The people who become radical do not fit in any community, either mainstream or ethnic community. And the radicalization happens at the border or line, fuzzy line between ethnic or strong cultural groups and the mainstream, and people who change several time places. Lots of the people involved in or interested in radical acts are people who are very mobile. Another factor to take into account is what the European calls term, what is called now Islamophobia. What does it mean? I don't have time to get into a big discussion on that. Again, in all the survey we do not take it as granted. I mean, Islamophobia is not real phenomenon in Europe as such. There are some acts that you can qualify as anti-Islamic. We do not go to the point to call everything Islamophobia. But the point is that the discourse on Islam in public space has been dominated by intellectuals, public intellectuals. I gave a few here that really have pushed forward a very strong anti-Islamic discourse. And it does contribute to this cultural marginalization that I've talked about, in the sense that Muslims who are not particularly religious or observant do not feel right that the people who monopolize today the position on Islam are only anti-Islam, or very secular Muslims who happen, like Irsha Ali, she doesn't even want to be called a Muslim anymore. So this is the kind of thing that are making the life or legitimacy of Muslims on a daily basis much more challenging. And that trigger lots of frustration among all the Islam Muslims I was referring to. Another factor, and I will end up here, I have 30 seconds, is the attraction of Islam as an anti-imperialist discourse. And this is very important in the European context. What we have seen is a lot of young people, even if they are not Muslims, are interested in Islam as, for example, a counter-globalization discourse. And we can see very strange alliance between Islamists and leftists on this counter-globalization discourse. This you can see on the ground happening. And I want just to finish on that. I mentioned here the importance or international role of some Muslim states. But what is also important is the networking of people who are operating outside states' influence and who are bringing in this anti-imperialist discourse. And today, for some young people, Muslims or non-Muslims, Islam is seen as the only ideology or alternative ideology at the global level. Outside liberalism, And this is to be taken into account. Lots of young people cannot identify to Europe as a cultural or political project yet, unless you belong to the elite that is shaping currently Europe. And I think it's not the case of most Europeans and not most Muslims either. So I'm going to end here and can just leave.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choudhury. My apologies for keeping a tight rule, but time is running away. So with that, let me also just very briefly introduce our next speaker, Professor Rahsaan Maxwell, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. His research focuses on ethnic minority migration integration and political behavior, with particular focus on Western Europe. He is currently completing a book manuscript under contract with Cambridge, which examines the trade-offs involved in immigrant integration. You should feel free to use the lecture to also state the title of your book for the audience. Pleasure. So you have the floor, Rahsaan.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you and all the organizers for inviting me here. I had a fellowship in 2008, 2009 in Washington, D.C., and I came to some of the Wilson Center events, so now it's nice to be here on this side of the event. So as a good academic, you sort of mentioned it, I will give my caveat in that I'm not a specialist in Islam, I'm not a specialist in religion, I'm not a specialist in Muslims. I do focus on immigrant integration, and particularly in Europe. And if you study immigrant integration in Europe, you can't ignore Muslims. So I have done research on Muslims, I have published a variety of papers. But I look at it from a different perspective, and that of immigrant integration in general, the broader and more historical components, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the question is, for this panel, is will Muslims and Europeans form a common identity? And the short answer is yes, in my view, or probably. So I would acknowledge that there are some tensions. We've talked about them today, we don't need to review them, but my point is that these tensions, they always exist with immigrants. Historically, they've been the case with every immigrant wave in all receiving countries, so I don't see that as a fundamental clash. In addition, there's tension inside of society. So there's this temptation to always consider immigrants or even Muslims as this external shock that is somehow coming into these stable, peaceful European societies. But society is a moving concept. It's not something that sits still. It's always changing. There are always debates. The big issues for Muslims today, which I'll talk about in a little more detail, are divided loyalties, their values, and segregation. And these three issues are general issues of our time. Divided loyalties are not just an issue for Muslims, they're an issue for everyone. Values, what are the values of society? Are we segregated? Are there opportunities? These are general issues of our time. So I think this notion of a Muslim crisis is overblown, and that's my point. And the main issue, the main argument that I'm saying is that Muslims, the issue of Muslims, should be considered one of immigrant integration, something that solves itself over time. So there are a number of ways to view Muslims, because we've talked about today this category of Muslims that means different things to many people. Obviously, in some senses, it's a religious category, because Islam is a religion. But as we've often seen, it's used in Europe to refer to anyone who not necessarily is even from a country or has origins in a country that is predominantly Muslim, but anyone who might be considered someone with origins in a Muslim country. So it's much broader than a religious category. In some senses, it's spreading out into a racial and ethnic category. But then it's also sometimes confused with a socioeconomic category. And you see the easy slippage when you're talking about Muslims in Europe with socioeconomic disadvantage and Muslim, as if they were somehow synonyms. But what I want to say is that the best way to understand what's going on with Muslims in Europe is that of the immigrant integration process. So many are newcomers, some second and third generation, and that over time things will change. And that doesn't mean that religion, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status are irrelevant, but that these things will change over time. So this issue of divided loyalty, it's a real issue. I'm not denying that. In particular, there have been some studies. There was a Pew study in 2006 that everyone loves to cite, which found that Muslims are more likely to identify with their religion than with their citizenship of the country in Western Europe. In addition, they had very strong senses of Islamic identity. They felt their Islamic identity was growing. And you hear these arguments from Hirsi Ali, Christopher Caldwell, the notion that Muslims are not sufficiently attached to European society. And so my response to this concern from my research and from others is that, again, this concern about divided loyalties is typical. It comes from the long historical examples of immigrants who were seen as in conflict with the host society, from the Italian anarchists early in the 20th century, Japanese World War II. We know the examples. Kennedy as a Catholic. And it is true that there are often justifications for these concerns. It's not that they're made up, but there are often overblown. So as we've seen all this discussion about terrorists are not necessarily the majority or even, or they're in fact a tiny minority, but in addition, my point is that it's possible for them to hold Islamic identities. It's possible to feel part of some international community while at the same time feeling attached to the national community. And multiple identities is something that we're all very familiar with. We all have identities as perhaps parents, children. We're all children of someone. We have brothers, sisters, professional identities, community identities, religious identities, and they're not mutually exclusive. So it's possible for people to criticize society and feel attached to a broader Islamic identity while at the same time feeling part of that society. And all of us in here who are American are either critiquing this current administration, or we critique the previous administration, or we critique both administrations, and we can all still be American at the same time. And that is what my research shows is going on among Muslims in Europe. They're criticizing some real issues in European society, and they are feeling attached to those societies. And in fact, research shows that Muslims have some of the most positive attitudes about society in Europe. Tufyal mentioned a bit of it. They have higher levels of national belonging when you don't pose the question as a mutually exclusive question, high levels of trust in European government, high levels of trust in parliament, the political system. In fact, their positive attitudes of trust in all these areas are often higher than those of non-Muslims or of native Europeans. So it's possible to criticize and still feel loyal. We all do it in our own way. Now, some of you might find this strange, the notion that Muslims in Europe are somehow have all these positive attachments to the mainstream political entities and institutions. And the response to that is that, again, it's a standard story of immigrant integration. Immigrants in general have more positive political attitudes than natives for any number of reasons, the main one being they made a conscious decision to move to the country to improve their life. So they're going to be predisposed to view those countries in a positive way. There's lots of research on this in the U.S. with Mexicans who are more likely to be patriotic than Anglos, whatever you want to call us. And there's even the bigger the gap with the homeland institutions. So the more you come from a country that has weak democratic institutions, the more positive you're going to be in the host society. And then in addition, over time and across generation, immigrant political attitudes converge with natives. And in fact, I have some research showing that on the subnational level is the best way to understand how immigrants feel about society, how they trust in government, trust the international institutions, their satisfaction in education, economy, healthcare, their ideology, their voting behavior, a big issue, left, right, their authoritarianism, their efficacy, even their attitudes towards other immigrants. The best way to know what Muslims think about these issues is to know where they live. And that's why Tufyal's research on all the different open societies, research on all those different communities shows that there is not necessarily a European Islam, or there's not necessarily a European Muslim community, but the best way to understand it is to find where they live, and where they live, they look like the natives in those communities. So the takeaway message from this point is that Islamic identity is important, and I'm not denying that there are issues, but that can coexist with an attachment to local European communities, and that can coexist with this classic story of immigrant integration. And so the second big fear is of segregation and cultural conflict. So even if Muslims don't have these divided loyalties abroad, there's a fear that once they become European, they're going to become European in a bad way. They're going to become segregated. And that's based on a lot of fears about the U.S., where you had some migrants, in particular Mexicans, who were seen as assimilating the wrong way. They become American, but they become American and segregate into actually African-American styles of music and drugs and criminality. And so you see similar issues in Europe. It's called segmented assimilation in the academic literature. And there's a fear this can lead to violent riots. But in reality, when you look at the evidence, most of the riots that people are talking about in Europe are not Muslim riots. We saw some really irresponsible portrayals of the French riots and urban unrest riots in 2005, which were people who were marginalized in society, some of which may have had Muslim origins, but there was not some form of Muslim organization. And we've heard earlier today all these issues about people being afraid of mobilization to implement Sharia, and how that is probably overblown and not really a strong political movement. So again, there are issues, but much of these segregated issues are being solved in the technocratic level, and that's an issue of how to adjust Muslim concerns to European institutions. That's a growing area of politics, a growing area of research, and it is an important issue, how to adjust Muslim needs in European institutions. But it's not one that's mobilizing mass support. It's not one that's leading to this clash of identity. And so my conclusion is that, again, there are issues. We all know what they are, but if we take the broader perspective, we'll see that over time, immigrants integrate, and Muslims are, in many respects, typical immigrants with their own particularities, but it's a story of integrating.
Thank you. Thank you very much, in particular for sticking to the severe time limit, which will not put our final speaker in too much under pressure. Professor Senemaydin Düzgit, who is assistant professor in the Department of International Relations at Istanbul Bilgi University. She's also an associate research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, where she got her PhD. And also she's assistant editor of the South European Security and Politics Journal. She has a number of publications to her credit, most recently Civil Society Dialogue Between France and Turkey, Transcending Stereotypes, published by her university press. Having just been to your great city, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to Washington. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, today I will talk very briefly about this issue of culture and identity in Turkey's relations with the European Union. And first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about how significant this issue of culture and identity concerning attitudes towards Turkish accession in the European Union. Now, we know that in general, support for Turkey's accession to the EU is low in the European Union states, particularly in countries such as Germany, France, and Austria. And some others. And when we look at studies that have been done to find out the dynamics behind this opposition, we see that the major reasons focus on identity-related arguments, rather than instrumental considerations that focus on costs and benefits of Turkey's accession to the EU in institutional terms or economic terms or what have you. So basically these concerns seem to be much more marginal, especially in the eyes of the public opinion, rather than identity-related matters. Now, what do I mean by identity-related matters? I basically mean the most commonly known argument that Turkey is not part of Europe in the geographical sense of the word, in the historical or the cultural sense of the word. Now, of course, one can argue that this is an essentialist vision, which conceptualizes Europe as a geographically delimited entity with a strong sense of a common identity, with a common culture, history, and tradition. And what we also see in relation to this is that this degree of loss of cultural unity, this threat of this fear of this losing this cultural unity, is very positively intertwined with the number of Turkish migrants in Europe. Basically, in other words, in places where you have a large concentration of Turkish migrants in the EU, opposition to Turkey's accession seems to be much more pronounced, especially on these culture and identity-based grounds. Now, of course, this is one side of the argument. Now, on the other side of the argument, you see a post-national vision, which rests on a vision of a rights-based union, which emphasizes democracy and human rights, cultural plurality, a cosmopolitan identity, where cultural differences are respected without necessarily subjecting them to a certain hierarchical ordering. Now, since we see in all the academic work done in this field that these concerns, especially at the level of public opinion, are mostly identity-based, of course it becomes crucial as to how you argue for Turkey's accession to the EU at the elite level within the European Union, which brings us to the discourses of the EU elites on this issue. Now, I will here make a gross generalization for, of course, time constraints, and argue that here we see very broadly two camps of argumentation on this matter. Now, on the one hand, you have the categorical rejection of Turkey's accession on culturalist, essentialist grounds. Most of us know this story with Valéry Giscard d'Estaing or Nicolas Sarkozy, who explicitly argued that Turkey is not European, it can never become a part of Europe, the usual argument. Now, in many instances, and particularly in for example, the case of France, we see that this argument is intertwined very closely with a vision of a more federal Europe. That is a more tightly unit, that is institutionally much more tightly coherent, able to act with one voice, etc. So there is a political vision involved there as well. And within the scope of this argument, of course, Turkey is hereby excluded by its very nature. It is excluded from this coherent cultural entity. Now, within this broader discursive paradigm, you have various subunit arguments, such as those on the Copenhagen political criteria. Basically respect for democracy and human rights can be conceptualized within this scope as a matter of culture and identity. Similarly, sovereignty, the issue of national pride, national sovereignty in the case of Turkey, can also be conceptualized as a matter of Turkish culture and identity. And it's also important how these arguments conceptualize the notion of secularism in Turkey, whereby the argument goes along the lines that it's almost impossible to have secularism in a Muslim setting without very, very strict control of religion, which in fact in certain times, feeds into alliances with more authoritarian streaks in Turkish society, such as the Turkish military or some other segments of the judiciary. Now, of course, here I'd also like to note that there is a distinction at certain points between being in favor of Turkish accession and not being engaged in these culturalist arguments. I mean, there are those in Britain, for example, who would very much like to see Turkey as a member of the European Union. But if you go analyze deeper into the discourse, you would see that at the cultural, at the identity level-based arguments, they do not hold, well, not all of them, but especially those from the Conservative Party and some others, you would see that they hold very similar lines when it comes to argumentation on the basis of differences of culture and identity. But for them, that's a matter of concern. That's not a matter of concerns, since they conceptualize, again, in their political vision, the EU as an intergovernmental project rather than a federal union or a more, I would say, tightly knit union. Now, the second camp is the more, of course, left liberal groups within the EU or certain institutional organs, bodies of the EU, such as the European Commission, where you have this emphasis on this legal motto of unity and diversity in the EU, which is the official legal underpinnings of EU cultural policy as well. But I think there are two caveats that we need to emphasize here. Now, one of them is, and this is also an outcome of my research and the book that I'm working on right now, is that this unity seems to be still at large sought in the extent to which substantial notions of culture, such as religion, are being expressed in society. It is true that most of these groups do not hold on to an understanding of what we call as, the type of a Judeo-Christian secularism that denies the possibility of being secular in the European sense in a Muslim setting. But however, it is still an understanding that necessitates very clear boundaries between the public and private in the expression of religion. Now, of course, to make it a bit more concrete, when you look at the policy-related implications of this, you see, for example, the stance of the European Commission regarding the headscarf ban in Turkey. There is a headscarf ban in Turkey. It's very strictly applied in universities as well as, secondary and primary schools. Where, even though the Commission has been a very active entrepreneur in the opening of accession negotiations, in the promotion of democracy and democratic consolidation in the country, when it came to the issue of religious freedom, such as the wearing of the headscarf, it has remained a very silent observer. And the second caveat, of course, relates to this issue of sovereignty. That seems, of course, at surface not to be so much related to this issue of identity and culture, but at the discursive level, especially again in the institutions of the Commission and more supranational bodies of the European Union, it seems to be a culturally inspired attitude that somehow needs to be overcome. Now, of course, at a more general level, when you look at the policy implications, one can argue that, yes, of course, culture and identity seems to be an important variable at the discursive level, at the level of public opinion and also the elites, but does it have any policy-related implications? It does. There are more symbolic ones, such as the recent exclusion of Turkey from the map of euro coins, let's say, for example, that were redesigned after the 2004 enlargement. But there are also some more substantial ones, such as this notion of absorption/integration capacity of the European Union to absorb Turkey, which resulted in the introduction of permanent derogations in the EU's negotiation framework with Turkey, which means that permanent derogations in various fields, including the free movement of people, would be introduced once Turkey ever becomes a member to the European Union. Of course, this runs counter to EU's own law, EU's own political principles that, of course, guarantees equality of all member states. Now, as a way of conclusion, do we see any ground for hope here? In terms of the emergence of perhaps a more cosmopolitan identity on the part of the EU, and also, of course, in terms of change also within Turkey towards a more consolidated democracy. Now, we know that currently, of course, there are huge difficulties that both Turkey and also the European Union are going through. The EU is going through an economic crisis, and various other speakers have also pointed out, there's a rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric, a rise of far-right parties, so it has its own problems. Institutional problems are not yet over, even though the Lisbon Treaty is now in force. Now, with Turkey, of course, it has its own internal governance problems that I'm not going to go into. Also, now some foreign policy issues as well that are being very much related to internal societal movements. But change, I believe, just to conclude on a more positive note, I believe that change might be possible where differences are respected more, where otherness is being recognized, and there's positive value placed on difference rather than a supranational European identity that is construed along the lines of the nation state, or an official European identity that is constantly in tension with national identities. But this, of course, in itself involves a transformation through a two-way relationship of interdependency between EU and Turkey, where encounters with others, hence in this case Turkey, will in fact challenge and force the European self or the European selves to recognize and respect this diversity. But I believe the crucial hunch there is that this transformation largely hinges on Turkey's own cosmopolitan journey. Basically, that the way in which Turkey is facing challenges of living with difference and diversity within its borders. Now, democratic consolidation is yet incomplete. There are still serious problems in the country regarding various areas such as judicial reform, human rights, etc., etc. But more importantly, within Turkey, one of the most crucial problems is this increasing problem of trust between the secularists and the so-called Islamists, and this ambivalence on the part of the political Islamists themselves, who have been, during even the second term in government, who have been very ambivalent on the public role of Islam. Basically, they define themselves as conservative Democrats, claiming to give voice to Turkish people's values, but how are these values defined, justified, selected, remain highly ambivalent and highly dangerously ambivalent, of course, for the secularists in the country. That, of course, has an impact on the rising degrees of mistrust between these constituencies. But on the other hand, it is also true that Turkey has reached a point in its modern history where differences and recognition of these differences are being more widely debated than ever in its public sphere. It has been experiencing a certain degree of reflexivity, a certain degree of critical self-examination on who we are, on who we should be, who we're thought to be, regarding a variety of issues such as the Armenian issue, minority rights, religious rights, etc., but of course not yet to a sufficient extent. But my conclusion would be that these changes within Turkey, slow but happening, they can be key to shaping the future trajectory of the conceptualization of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism within the EU, which is why relations between EU and Turkey, I believe, needs to be kept alive, despite, of course, the setbacks that stem from both sides. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me perhaps start off, since time was limited and our speakers didn't go into this. I'd love to, if Jocelyn and Rasan, if you could talk briefly about your methodology and the sources you used. You both referred to your research, and I think it's important to just get that out on the table, what your research is based on that you presented. In your case, it's slightly less of an issue. Yes.
Thank you for asking. So the research I'm referring to is a 2-year study in cities, Paris, London, Berlin, Amsterdam, and we did focus groups, 12 focus groups per city to cover all diversity in terms of ethnicity, level of religiosity, gender, generation, and we also decided to have groups that would be either only female, only male, and co-ed, to make sure that we were getting all, because sometimes women may be intimidated or men may be intimidated, and it was very interesting to compare what people were saying in co-ed versus gendered groups only. And so this is the data we have now. And we have also lots of data that we didn't produce ourselves, but that had been produced in different national contexts, and that we can compare with our own results, either on religious practices or political participation. Yeah.
Thank you.
The research that I've published myself is primarily from 2 sets of surveys. One is called the Home Office Citizenship Survey in the United Kingdom, which was started after the urban unrest of 2001. It's a biannual survey with a lot of questions about communities and interaction. And then broader research from the European Social Survey, which covers, depending on the module, it covers 25 to 30 different European countries, very good sample sizes and very good detailed questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, the floor is open for comments and questions. Yes. Please wait for the microphone so folks who are watching this webcast via webcast can understand.
People don't usually say I need a microphone. I was just going to ask Dr. Choudhury to comment on something that I think would be of benefit for the audience. Can you make a comment on the distinction between the 19th century Salafis and the use of the term Salafism today to refer to what is in effect Wahhabism?
Yes.
Thank you.
This is a very relevant question to all this amnesia of Muslims today with these terms. The Salafi the use of the term Salafi that I refer to is actually a very recent one, which I call the monopoly taken over by the Wahhabi on this term. Initially, in the 19th century, the Salafia movement was a reformist movement, but it was a modernist movement that didn't posit itself against the West, but really in an attempt to bridge up what was the Islamic tradition with modernization coming from Europe at the time. This kind of modernist Salafi approach has more or less disappeared. In most of Muslim countries, actually. I was in Egypt recently. I interviewed people and I asked them about the legacy of Mohammed Abdu. They are very embarrassed about this. Is not someone or some figure that they refer to, and this is kind of shocking when you know the history and the legacy of this movement. The term Salafi, as it is used now, is a very recent globalization of the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. And it goes with this monopoly of the true Islam. This is an aspiration, a claim to be the representative of the true Orthodox Islam. As one of my interviewees said, it's like as if the Ku Klux Klan would have taken over the global version of Christianity, if we can compare. And that's what happened with the current Salafi Wahhabi-inspired discourse. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Sonia?
Yeah, Sonia Michelle from the Wilson Center. This is a question for Professor Choudhury. Could you be a little more specific about the Islamic radicals, whether they are, which of your three categories you would put them into, Salafi, Islamists or jihadis, in terms of, and could you also talk a little bit about their socioeconomic status? For example, one of the factors that you said you thought created radical or Islamic radicalization was Islamophobia and also the attraction to Islam as an anti-imperialist discourse. Those are kind of elite academic discourses. They're Van Gogh or Herzl, people like that. So the average Islamic man or woman in the street, is he or she going to be aware of those figures, of those discourses, of those ideas? In other words, how do they get connected? How would you make the argument that that Islamophobia has a negative effect that leads to radicalization? How would you kind of connect those dots?
Thank you.
There are two questions, right? There's two different questions. First, the list I gave, none of the different factors I listed can be taken as such as the cause of radicalization. Okay, it's a combination of all these factors all together. The Islamophobia discourse, quote unquote, you are right, it's carried on by intellectuals. But this is very present in the public space of most of European countries. It is there. It is not automatically carried by these people only, but their rhetoric is shared by other people, and they reflect this common or very loose anti-Islamic feeling. You can even get it at your bakery, or interaction in the grocery store. So this is exactly the narrative that is going on in different places, and that Muslims resent as an obstacle to their legitimacy. Again, even if they are not Salafi, what I want to emphasize here that neither Salafi, nor Islamist, nor Jihadi represent the majority of Muslims. The one we have interviewed do not belong to any of these categories. But the political and public discourse on Islam is most of the time articulated and shaped in these categories. Either you reject it, you approve them, it's either pro or contra. And this very strong polarization doesn't restitute the reality of Muslim, which is much more hybrid, much more pragmatic than this public discourse. I don't know if I've responded to you.
Could you say a little bit more about the socioeconomic status of the radicals?
Oh, of the radicals. I mean, the statistics that come up most of the time show that, especially in France, and it's not true in the UK as such, but you have two different categories. You have people that are called the lumpen proletariat or the lumpen Muslims, and that also go with identification to traffic networks, so trabando kind of informal network. And these people, you can find them in the segregated areas. This is one group. For example, last year in France, there were 19, it's not so many, you know, but 19 arrests on terrorist ground, and most of the people were belonging to this category. The second group is much more educated, more in ascendance toward middle class. And sometimes they can connect, but sometimes they do not connect. Okay, so you have two different groups here. One is more the kind of gang culture you could find, and it happened that they will be involved in some kind of political actions, and others are more ideologically driven and much more articulated in terms of the kind of identification they want to have, and it may be more individual than collective.
Thank you. John Lampe, microphone on here.
Yeah, John Lampe, Wilson Center and University of Maryland. And following on with socioeconomic in France, let me ask Professor Maxwell, because I was taken with your focus on immigrant experience overall. I think that is indeed relevant. But I'm wondering, since you talked about the immigrants, they made the effort, they came, they adjusted, and I wonder if that's not part of the French and perhaps other stories where, yes, they came and they made their adjustment, and then this younger generation that's born in the country, born with perhaps with higher expectations and also connected to modern iPhone and other technologies, and communicating back to the Middle East or globally or in the French neighborhoods just with each other. If that isn't an extra feature, and I don't know if in your anything that you've looked at for the French suburb problems, if indeed the Islamic element can really be isolated out, or if it's more generational.
Respond directly?
Yep.
So yeah, for the issue of the first generation versus the second generation, clearly the dynamic that I described of having high expectations, of having optimism because you came, applies to the immigrants themselves. Most evidence shows that the children who were born in the country are pretty much similar to other natives born in the country in terms of their attitudes. Again, attitudes towards these basic political institutions like trust in government, trust in parliament, how do you feel about the political system in general. So there's pretty much a convergence on that level. What is different, as I said, is that people can critique society. So the second generation also is clearly much more sensitive to discrimination. And the second generation is clearly much more likely to develop these various identities that we're all talking about. But that doesn't mean that they're not simultaneously looking like natives on other dimensions. And I think someone in the previous panel, said that it's a struggle to be accepted as European. So there is definitely a generational issue. Second generation is not as positive as the first generation, but in fact, on most of these indicators, they're like natives, although they have a particular concern about discrimination, which is clear. On the issue of the French suburbs, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. I think if you look in a broad comparative framework, the Islamic factor is everyone in France is so happy that it's less relevant there than elsewhere in Europe. But as far as isolating the Islamic factor, I'm not sure what you're asking. I'm not sure what you're asking with that question.
Is it relevant or?
I mean, sure, Islam is relevant for some people in certain places. It depends what you're talking about.
I see. Well, sorry, I clarified.
All right. Any other questions or comments for the panelists? Yes.
Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. As I look at the formation of identities, war has a major place. People define themselves in terms of historical conflict, and especially in Europe, France, Britain, Germany, the identities were hardened and forged in wars. Recent weeks, we're talking about Turkey, involved in two issues in preventing war: Gaza, Iran. Let's say these efforts are not successful. Let's say there is a third intifada or an attack on Iran. How would that affect the identities in Europe we're looking at here for the new decade?
Go ahead, Sana. Go ahead.
Is that for me?
I think so.
Right. You mean, I don't actually understand the first part of the question. You mean the mediation efforts are successful, or what is successful, or? Because I mean,
let's say conflicts break out.
Yeah.
How would people side on that? Would that reinforce identities? Would that change identities?
Mm. Well, I mean, of course, it depends how things fold out in the Middle East with respect to these two conflicts that you're talking about. But from where I stand, I think the identifications on that part, I mean, the European identity in the sense, I mean, it's so diverse, you can't really generalize it or simplify it, I guess. But I think the position might be one in which it depends. It's difficult. I mean, it depends on how it unfolds. As I said, I mean, let's say if there is an attack on Iran, let's just, hypothesize that nothing works out, sanctions don't work out, and everything unfolds, then I do suppose that, the Eurocentric identities would remain as they are, and those who are the minority who have been, opposing this in Europe would already stay there. So perhaps in that sense it could reinforce things, yes. But if you talk about Turkey, for example, I would say that in Turkey it would very much reinforce the already growing resentment at the level of society with the West, and not just with the US, but also with the European Union. Okay, in that sense, it would reinforce an already ongoing trend that's already there, rather than introduce a new dimension altogether.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. It's on, yeah, I think. Is it? It's not on after all.
Is that better?
That's better, yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask Jocelyn and Rassan about the relationship they see between religious identity and the foregrounding of religious identity and religious practice. Because I guess one of the things that strikes me in my take is that for a lot of younger generation Muslims, there isn't a correlation between foregrounding their religious identity and religious practice. Their parents may be more pious and practicing, but they won't necessarily identify themselves in religious terms, whereas they will foreground their religious identity. And some of it is about actually using religious identity as a way of negotiating with their parents, and that there's a danger of seeing things purely from the perspective of the state, whereas if you're a young person growing up, the biggest force in your life is often your parents, and what you're trying to do is to negotiate with them, and they're telling you to be an Arab or to be Pakistani, and society is telling you to be British or French, and here's this identity of being Muslim which scares both sides and belongs to neither of them either, and it's a space for experimentation.
Yes, thank you for asking this question, because it's a very crucial point here about we used to consider that someone would say, I am Christian or Muslim or Jewish, will go with some kind of practice related to this definition or testimony of identity. Today it doesn't work this way anymore. And what we see is in the groups we conducted, lots of people would say that they are Muslims. But what was also interesting, unlike what we hear a lot, they had some reluctance when they were asked if they would put this qualification first in any interaction they would have outside. They would say no. This term is put on us, but we are not automatically identifying to it. And you're absolutely right that the practice is, we cannot say that it's an orthodox practice or even a traditional practice. They do lots of different things. That's what I call this hybrid, and they have lots of mixed references. But what we find is a high positive vision of the practice of Islam, what I was trying to say. I'm not doing it right. Sometimes I drink, sometimes I am mixed up in different kind of situation. But if I could, that's why we had the question of what is the ideal. I would do this, and this, And so you have this disjunction between identifying to Islam, practicing it, and also this aspiration to an ideal Muslim or man or woman, and the criteria are not the same for both. And so this is a kind of fascinating thing that happened in the discussion groups between people who had very opposite vision of that. Yeah.
I'll just say quickly, I agree with everything you said, and I'll add that the one piece that I've noticed from my research is that the way some of the Islamic identity gets deployed among some people in the younger generation, and by younger I guess we're talking about born in the country, because they can be 40 or 50 years old at this point in some places, is often in terms of politics, because that's sort of my focus, is through community engagement, and in many respects in ways that are not distinguishable from other forms of community engagement. And by that I mean that when looking in local level municipalities, which is where I've done research, and looking at which community groups are engaged with local government, those that are identified as Muslim are asking for the same things that other community groups are asking for, which is, better support for their kids to get better access to schools, better programs, and that. Now, like I said, I'm not a specialist in all forms of Islamic mobilization. There are clearly other forms of Islamic mobilization, but when you talk to people who, and clearly the reason why these groups are being listened to by the local government is because they're not, and the reason they're engaged with local government is because they're not making wild claims. But if you look at the way in which Islamic identity gets mobilized in local politics, it's in a rather a mundane way.
Final question.
Yeah, this is a question for Rassan Maxwell and Jocelyn Cesari. 2 weeks ago, we got in Germany a study who tries to show us the relationship between people who are, or young Muslim men, that is it's special for the male, to show the relationship between to be religious and also to accept violence. By your experience do you think or take it as serious, or do you think, as so many Muslims in Germany think, it is a trick by politics to reactivate the Islamophobia? What do you think about this relationship between violence and religion?
Yeah, I'll say briefly. So I think these surveys are being done across Europe. I was in somewhat of an argument a couple of weeks ago with a colleague in the Netherlands where they did a very similar survey through the Ministry of the Interior, and they asked a very similar question: do you advocate the use of violence to forward political means? And they had this according to him, a surprisingly high percentage of these young men who were in agreement. My take might not be the most common, but my take is that everyone is in agreement with the use of violence to forward political means. It's called the state. It's also called the police. And so I'm not sure exactly how this question was phrased to these people. You can then go further. We obviously, in this country, whether we like it or not, we're sanctioning wars to forward political views. That is what it is. the more important question is, do you justify being a vigilante, taking a knife and stabbing someone in the street? I mean, that's the more important question. And obviously that is a concern. I'm not going to deny that. That is a concern. But I think that crude question is probably mixing a lot of things. And the more important question is, how much are you going to take these issues into your own hands and go outside the law? And I think the results might look a little different than what they got in that crude question.
The survey we have, not only the one I mentioned, but the one that have been done by other groups across Europe, show that there is no systematic correlation between religious practice and violence, despite lots of the discourse we hear. It depends to what kind of religious discourse you identify to. And most of the time what we see is actually religious identification and involvement in some kind of work related to your belief may produce more citizenship and civic identity than the opposite. So, but of course, if you identify to some of these very intolerant, separatist form of Islam, doesn't mean you become violent automatically. You can become separatist. You can say, I withdraw. This is not my country. This is not my business. I don't belong there. It doesn't mean you become violent. There are lots, in other words, there is a lot of spectrum from civic engagement in the name of religion to withdrawal from the main stream environment to active political fight. And so it is impossible if you are credible, objective researcher to just draw one of this correlation between religion and violence.
Thank you. I think we'll have to leave it with that. Thanks to our panelists for 3 stimulating presentations. Thanks to all of you for sticking around for most of the day. Let me thank the Open Society Institute's At Home in Europe project and also the Center for Islamic Pluralism for their support of this meeting. I like to thank everybody here for the good discussion we've had, and we're adjourned with that just about on time. Thank you.
Thank you.